a verse in the Old Testament, a verse in Joshua. The last part of this verse we usually see on plaques as you enter someone's home, but we're going to read the whole part of that verse. It's Joshua 24. We're going to read verse 15, and then we're going to talk a little bit, and then we're going to come back and read that whole passage. Joshua chapter 24, so the very last chapter in Joshua, verse 15. But if serving the Lord seems undesirable to you, then choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve, whether the gods of your ancestors served beyond the Euphrates or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you are living. But as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord. Most of you guys know that it was prom last night. Bella is joining us, but I told her if I see her falling asleep, I'm just going to be like, Bella! She did prom and after prom. And as I was thinking about the sermon this week, I'm not worried about Bella, and I'm not worried about our kids, but I was thinking about just parenting in general, and how sometimes you know as a parent the decisions that your kids are going to make before they ever make them, right? You know, like if this decision was set forward, you know exactly how they would choose. And sometimes you trust them that they're going to make a different choice in whatever decision it was. Like you trust that they're going to make a different choice. But a lot of times kids just have their own mindset, right? I'm talking to you guys. I know you understand that. Kids just kind of have their own different mindsets. And so I want us to remember that as we kind of go in through this. We're going to look at this text in the Old Testament. And basically right before this text, there's this rundown of Old Testament history. The Lord speaks through Joshua and says, this is what I've done, and this is what I've done, and this is what I've done. And I want us to kind of go through that. We're going to kind of go through some it in our own way. We're going to talk about, remember, we talked about not too long ago creation, how God created out of nothing. That's where we have this ex nihilo, this word ex nihilo, creating out of nothing. God created out of nothing all of creation, including Adam and Eve, and he created Adam and Eve to worship him, and he set these boundaries for Adam and Eve, and Adam and Eve stepped outside those boundaries, right? Much like we set boundaries for our children, and let's be honest, we all know which kids are going to step outside those boundaries, right? We know that. And we still set them because we expect them to follow through with the boundaries that we set. But Adam and Eve stepped outside those boundaries, and then we have this continual story in the biblical text, the Tower of Babel, the Great Flood, all this where they kind of go, we'll worship you, and then they turn away, and God gets upset because God is an angry God, or is a jealous God, and they continue to make this decision of, we'll do what it is that you've asked us to do, and they turn away, right? Like when you read through the Torah, right, the Pentateuch, that's what you read, right? Is all these stories of people. Yes, we will worship you. We will even build a huge tower to you, and they continue to turn away. And so, in setting this up, this is where in Joshua comes in, is God has brought the Israelites out of Egypt, right? Moses has been the leader to bring the Israelites out of Egypt, and they say, yes, we will worship God. And this is a key point. They come out of Egypt to worship God, right? That's their whole purpose. They say, we're going to go and worship God. And God brings them out of Egypt, parts the Red Sea, or as David would argue with me, he's like, it's not the Red Sea, it's the Reed Sea. And he has this whole, so if you ever want to get into a debate with a 13-year-old over what's in the Bible, bring up that and he will debate you. Anyway, Moses, God parts the sea, we'll say that. God parts the sea, they come through, and they say, yes, we'll believe in God and we'll worship him, and then they don't. And then God's like, they spend those 40 years wandering around in the desert, right? We know that story. And then they come to the point where Joshua leads them into the promised land, the land that Abraham was brought to, and God said, your descendants will be many and you will be blessed with this land, right? And Joshua leads them into it. Moses is now dead. Moses was not able to enter into the promised land. And Joshua is the leader, and he leads them into the promised land. And they have this really great battle. And then because of something that someone did in that battle, stepped outside the boundaries and didn't worship God fully with their heart, their next battle, they have some issues. And it was proof that their issues were proof that not all of them respected that boundary that God had set for them. And hopefully, if you've ever read through the Old Testament, specifically the first part of the Old Testament, you see this repetition taking place. This, we're going to worship God, and now we're going to turn away, and we're going to worship God, and now we're going to turn away. And the Old Testament has a lot to deal with the issues that Israel had. And so, as I said, leading up into this passage, God is speaking through Joshua and saying, these are the things that I have done as your God. These are the things that I have done. You have witnessed these things. And now you're here in the promised land. And then we're gonna read this. This is all that's happened so far. And so we're gonna start now at verse 14. And we're going to read through verse 28. So again, Joshua chapter 24, verse 14. Now fear the Lord and serve him with all faithfulness. Throw away the gods your ancestors worshipped beyond the Euphrates rivers and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. But if serving the Lord seems undesirable to you, then choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve, whether the gods of your ancestors served beyond the Euphrates, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you are living. But as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord. And the people answered, far be it from us to forsake the Lord to serve other gods. It was the Lord our God himself who brought us and our parents out of Egypt from the land of slavery, and performed those great signs before our eyes. He protected us on our entire journey and among all the nations through which we traveled. And the Lord drove out before us all the nations, including the Amorites who lived in the land. We too will serve the Lord because he is our God. And Joshua said to the people, you are not able to serve the Lord. He is a holy God. He is a jealous God. He will not forgive your rebellion and your sins. If you forsake the Lord and serve foreign gods, he will turn and bring disaster on you and make an end of you after he has been good to you. But the people said to Joshua, no, we will serve the Lord. And then Joshua said, you are witnesses against yourself that you have chosen to serve the Lord. Yes, we are witnesses, they replied. Now then, said Joshua, throw away your foreign gods that are among you and yield your hearts to the Lord, the God of Israel. And the people said to Joshua, we will serve the Lord our God and obey him. On that day, Joshua made a covenant for the people, and there at Shechem he reaffirmed for them the decrees and laws. And Joshua recorded these things in the book of law, and he took a large stone and set it up there under the oak tree near the holy place of the Lord. "See," he said to all the people, "this stone will be a witness against you. It has heard all the words the Lord has said to us. It will be a witness against you if you are untrue to your God." And then Joshua dismissed the people, each to their own inheritance. So Joshua assembles the tribes at Shechem, and he gives the words that God speaks, and then he basically says, we haven't been the greatest at following what it is that God's asked us to do. We haven't been the greatest at staying in the boundaries. Now, a few points that I feel I need to point out because of how a lot of times we'll use this scripture, "As for me and my house will serve the Lord." Joshua, if we read through that again, Joshua doesn't force them to worship God, right? Joshua says, you have to make a decision. You have to make a decision. Because Joshua knew that worshiping God and worshiping God fully in our lives, right? This worship of God isn't an easy thing. There are boundaries, and you have to respect God's boundaries and not step outside of those. And he goes, I understand that we as a nation have not been the greatest at that. As the Israelites, we have not been the greatest of staying in God's boundaries. And even when he makes that statement, "As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord," Joshua can't tell everybody in his house, you absolutely will worship the Lord. That is a decision that each one of them has to make. And so he's saying, as far as I have to do with any of it, I'm going to set the example to worship the Lord. As far as I have anything to do with it, because I can't make a decision for everybody in my household to worship the Lord. But as far as I have anything to do with it, I will set that example. Because it's an individual choice. Because this is one of those scriptures, we could take it a lot of different ways. And I encourage us not to take it as Joshua made his whole household worship the Lord. He forced them to do that. Because if we believe that, then we really believe that generationally we can pass down our belief. And that doesn't happen. Every generation has to make their own choice. This isn't something because we believe our kids automatically get in. Right? They have to make their own choice. And so I want to make us very careful on what we believe about that passage, because if we believe that Joshua can force anybody to believe and to worship God, we're going down a dangerous path. Anyway, there's always a choice in choosing to worship God, and Israel chose time and time again to turn away from worshiping God. And Joshua basically points that out again in verse 19. He says, you are unable to serve the Lord, right? You are unable. He had just said, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. And he had just said this, and the people answered, we will worship God. We will worship God. And Joshua said in verse 19, Joshua said to the people, you are not able to serve the Lord. He is a holy God. He is a jealous God. He will not forgive your rebellion and your sin. He is saying, I understand that this is your choice, but I also understand you're probably not going to make the right decision. Joshua's kind of bring back to mind that parent role. You know the decision your kids can make. You hope, you pray that they make a different decision. But sometimes when they're set forward with a decision, you know what decision they're going to make. And Joshua says, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. It'll be a choice. It's your choice too. And they say, we'll make that choice and we will serve God. And Joshua goes, I know what choice you're going to make. And you're going to say this, and you're not going to follow through. Joshua understood that even though they had come into the promised land, even though they had witnessed all these miracles, what miracles God had done in their generation, they probably weren't going to hold on to worshiping God for very long. They were probably going to upset those boundaries once again. And he realized this pattern. And Joshua, allergies are kind of going. And Joshua says, you realize that if you agree to this, if you agree to this now, and you don't follow through with this, then this is not going to be good for you. You realize the implications of your decision. I feel like we can put ourselves in Joshua's position at that point in time, right? I know I've said to my kids, remember all your decisions, there's an outcome, right? Like, and sometimes when you make bad decisions, you have to suffer that outcome. And Joshua's saying, you have to make this decision. And they say, we'll make this decision. We are going to make this decision. We will worship God. That is why we came. And Joshua goes, I hope you understand this. I hope you understand this. And then he said, you are witnesses against yourself. And the people's, yes, we are witnesses. We are witnesses that we say that we are going to worship the Lord. We are witnesses that we made this promise. And Joshua warns them once again, okay, if you're walking into this covenant, you need to make sure that you are doing what you are supposed to do. And Joshua gives that one more time. Throw away all your idols. Throw them away. If you are legit doing this, you need to make sure that you are doing this. And they say, yes, we will obey God and worship Him. And then it doesn't take us too long to read, just a few pages flipped, one in my Bible, in Judges chapter 2, verse 8. Joshua, son of Nun, the servants of the Lord, died at the age of 110, and they buried him in the land of his inheritance at Timnath-Heres, in the hill country of Ephraim, north of Mount Gaash. After the whole generation had been gathered to their ancestors, another generation grew up who knew neither the Lord nor what He had done for Israel. Then the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord and served the Baals. One page flip, right? One generation. Joshua was making this firm statement that as far as he had to do with any of it, that he was going to choose to follow the Lord. And he understood that the people around him probably weren't understanding what they were saying. And Joshua understood that he couldn't make this decision for everybody, that he could only make his choice, and he could only say, I will worship the Lord. And as far as I have it to do with any of my household, I will set the precedent. I will live my life in worship to God, right? Joshua understood that his decision was his decision only, and that following God wasn't something to be taken lightly. And then, and even now, choosing to follow God isn't always an easy task, right? This isn't something where we come into following God. We accept Jesus and what He died for, and we accept God and have this relationship with Him, and then life is just hunky-dory, right? It's not sunshine and roses all the time. We come up against opposition, right? And it's not always easy. And sometimes that opposition even comes from ourselves, right? Sometimes that opposition comes from ourselves. It is a daily dying to ourselves, right? Not putting ourselves in a position that we shouldn't be in. And at the time the Israelites were given the law, they realized that no matter what they did, the law could not be fulfilled through their actions, right? They strived for this. Some of them strived for it. And they realized that it wasn't through their own actions. And they realized that they couldn't have righteousness through their own actions. This wasn't anything that they could ever do. That there was a huge chasm, how great the chasm that laid between us. There was a great chasm that nothing could fill. And I think to an extent, Jesus has come and has filled that great chasm, right? We're able to have a relationship with God in the ways that they weren't able to. But as much as I feel like we start to feel that today as well. We start to feel that chasm. We start to feel that separation. We start to feel like there's a hole that nothing our actions can fill. And then, much like them, we have to come to a point in time in our lives where we realize that we can't worship idols anymore. That we need to worship God, and that He's the only thing that can fill that void in our lives. Jesus is the only thing that can fill that chasm, right? And we have to turn away from idol worship. We have to answer that question, much like Joshua gave to them. We have to turn away from idol worship. And as I said, sometimes we get in the way of our own selves. Because sometimes we feel like that idol worship is something that is going to fill that hole. We have to turn away from worshiping idols. And that's really a turning away from worshiping self, right? We've got to worship God. And I understand that sometimes that's hard. Because sometimes good things start to become idols for us. Like things that wouldn't necessarily be bad, aren't necessarily good or bad. Of course, there are some things that are bad that become idol for us. But sometimes there are things that isn't necessarily bad, but it can become an idol for us. Let's say power. Power isn't necessarily a bad thing. But if you're wanting power for the sake of yourself and to push away others that are lesser than you, power is becoming an idol. Money can become an idol for us. I know. Everybody I do too, a little bit when pastors say the word money. But I'm not saying we all need to give away all of our stuff and our possessions and our money. If God tells us to do that, absolutely. But I'm not saying that's what we need to do. But money can sometimes become an idol for us. We tend to idolize, I think in the world today, we tend to idolize self, and we tend to idolize power, and we tend to idolize money because we think that if we have power and if we have money, then we can rule the world and we can make everybody's decisions for them. And that's wrong. We can't, I'm just going to tell you straight. We can't change the world with our power. That there's only one that can change the world with his power. And that's a capital H, right? With his power. God's the only one that can change this world. God tells us if we have anything in our world that we've created as an idol, that we need to turn away from that. Sometimes we can idolize people. I have some of my favorite people as well, but if I place them above God, I'm making them an idol, right? If I choose their loyalty over my loyalty to God, then I'm making them an idol. Sometimes we idolize so many things. There are so many things nowadays that can become an idol very easily for us. Sometimes we idolize things. As I said, sometimes we idolize people. Sometimes we idolize places. Sometimes we idolize our possessions. Sometimes we idolize the places that we live, right? Sometimes we idolize buildings. Sometimes there's so many things that can become an idol. And I understand it is. When we talk about slow fade, it's a slow fade. Like we can idolize things and not even realize that we're really idolizing something until it's too late. And we need to be on top of that. This whole story, the biblical text is about our worship to God, right? I will worship you. We sang that this morning. I will worship you. God created so that all creation could worship him, right? We sing, all of creation sings the song of worship to God. The Israelites were led out of Egypt to worship God. And they were led into the promised land, and Joshua says, time and time again, you have been told to worship God, and you refuse, and we're renewing our covenant, and I don't think you understand what you are taking on here, that you are agreeing to, and I don't believe that you're actually going to worship God fully with your life. And, the next generation, they didn't. But, and I know we look at the Israelites as like, man, they just don't have their act together. They don't understand. Like, why do they continue to say, we'll worship God, and then turn away and break through those boundaries? I'm going to ask a question. I don't expect an answer. I just expect us to do a little self-reflection. But how many times after we have come to know Christ, after we have come to the knowledge that Christ is the only thing that can fill that hole, that can fill that chasm, how many times have we found something to idolize? Jesus came and we're offered a relationship with God, but we're called to worship God with our whole being, right? Our whole being, every part of ourselves. We're not supposed to idolize things. As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Bold statement, right? Joshua has this bold statement of power. But really, when we see this on plaques in front of people's houses. It's really the statement we should remember that we are called to worship God with our lives, because we learn shortly after the statement is made that people made a different decision. It's a reminder that we are called to worship God with our lives, and it's also a reminder. I know some people don't take this way. It's also a reminder when I see it that I'm not here to make anybody else's decision. I can't force anybody to believe in God. They have to come to that decision. But as far as my actions go, I need to make sure that I'm worshiping God and not worshiping idols, and that people can see that and that they come to know God through that. I can't make decisions for anybody. This verse should remind us that this isn't something that we do, but something that God does. We can't follow rules enough to make our own selves righteous, right? We can't follow the law to the letter of the law to the point where we can. That's why Jesus came, right? That's why Jesus came. We can only come to Jesus. And that's really the only way. In coming to Jesus, we make that decision. We are witnesses, right? Witnesses to that, and God's a witness to that, and he goes, you've come to me. You've come to me, and now you are to worship me. And that's what when we come into that decision, we say, Lord, I will worship you with my life. With all that depends on me, I will worship you with my life so that other people can see that. Now, because I want the glory for myself, because that's self-worship, that's idolization, but because I want people to know you. And that's what this verse is getting at. This is what this was the situation that Joshua was in at that time. So I want us to close out our morning this morning with the song Unbroken Praise, because that's what our life needs to be, is that unbroken praise, right? That unbroken worship to God fully in everything we say, do, think, our actions, all of that. We need to worship God. So let's sing Unbroken Praise.